Hello, my name is Melissa Miles and I'm a Professor of Art History and Photography Historian based at Monash University's Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture in Melbourne. It's a pleasure to be part of the Future States Conference today. My paper isn't just going to consider what magazines might show us about the links between national identities and modernity. It's going to look at what magazines don't show us and why we should consider the content of magazines in relation to the work through which magazines are made. I'm going to focus on two illustrated design magazines published in Sydney during the early 20th century, The Home and Decoration and Glass. Both of these magazines celebrated the latest innovations in modern design and lifestyle. What makes these magazines so compelling is the ways that different values, images, voices and ideas variously interconnect, overlap or contradict one another, creating different conceptual formations or patterns. The particular formation of ideas and images that I'm going to focus on today involves the city, labour and race. Amid economic depression and then recovery, the 1930s was a pivotal decade in which issues of labour, race and urban development took on new character. Race and labour have close historical and contemporary connections in countless parts of the world. In Australia, that connection goes back to British colonisation, but was formalised in Commonwealth law soon after Australian Federation in 1901, when the six formerly separate self-governing British colonies were brought together as the Commonwealth of Australia. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1901 was one of the first bills to pass the newly formed Commonwealth government. The Act allayed the fears of many Australian workers that Federation would put them at increased competition with so-called cheap labour from elsewhere in the Asia-Pacific, especially from China and Japan. As a key part of what became known popularly as the White Australia policy, the Immigration Restriction Act aligned Australia's racial identity with the British motherland by limiting the immigration of non-Anglo-Europeans to Australia. The almost entirely exclusive representation of Anglo-Celtic workers in images of labour, in the home and decoration and glass, in their features and in advertising, reflects the impact of this exclusive sense of national identity and its connection to work. Enter the Japanese-Australian photographer Ichiro Kageyama, whose work was fundamentally at odds with the depiction of labour and modernity in these magazines. Kageyama's practice highlights that the real story of the city, race and labour in these magazines isn't limited to what can be found in their pages. Understanding the type of magazines that Home and Decoration and Glass were involves understanding the particular character of modernism in Australia. Australians didn't experience modernisation as a dramatic revolution or sudden wave of change. Mass production manufacturing industries were not a significant part of the Australian economy until after the Second World War, and were not a part of a national tidal wave of industrial development or a large-scale dislocation of people from rural to urban centres as in some parts of Europe. The conception of modernity as a dramatic sense of the new displacing the old was experienced in Australia through stories and images, as a sense of anticipation for the new, rather than a radical shift. The Australian poet, novelist and children's writer Jean Kerr-Lewis captured this sense of anticipation in an article published in Home Easter Pictorial in 1928. Kerr-Lewis described Sydney as, quote, "a city in transition, not quite one thing nor yet the other, all memories and promises." Home and Decoration and Glass helped to crystallise that sense of promise by promoting modernism as something to desire and aspire to in everyday life. Modernism, as found in these magazines, can't be reduced to a particular outlook or aesthetic tradition. Modernism was a whole lifestyle. It could be experienced in many ways in the divergent modes and traditions of contemporary art, design, architecture, literature and fashion, advertising and opinions that converged in the magazines. Home was first published in 1920 by Sydney Ure Smith's firm Art in Australia Limited, which also published the art magazine Art in Australia. Home aimed to raise the tastes of Australian consumers by presenting the best architecture, fashion, interior design, art and people using the best production values. It wasn't intended to reach a mass audience like the British Women's Weekly, and despite its name, it wasn't centred on homemaking. Readers of Home would be out of luck if they were looking for everyday recipes or articles about child rearing. Nancy Underhill commented about this magazine in her biography of Ure Smith. Ironically, she wrote, its women lived outside the home rather than cloistered within it. One's home was a place in which one entertained or left for entertainment elsewhere. Home also reflected Ure Smith's interests in art and design. It commissioned some of Australia's leading photographers and artists, and occasionally their international contemporaries, to create images that celebrated the most beautiful that modern Australia had to offer. Ure Smith continued to shape the magazine after he sold Art in Australia Limited to Fairfax and Sons in 1934, but cut his links with his magazines reluctantly in 1938. Home continued to be published another 4 years after the sale. Decoration and Glass was more of an industry publication, pitched as a journal for home builders, architects and decorators. Launched in May 1935, this magazine was published by the body Australian Glass Manufacturers. It ran until 1949. Decoration and Glass promoted new building suppliers and manufacturers, which advertised in the magazine and featured in its articles. In his very first editorial, Walter Glover described the magazine's aim to educate readers about developments in home building and, quote, the various advantages introduced to homemaking by modern creative genius and mechanical science. Subjects included residential and industrial architecture, as well as hotels and other major modern building projects. Unlike Home, the image makers who contributed to Decoration and Glass were not typically foregrounded. Photo credits were a rarity in Decoration and Glass, whereas Home celebrated its creative contributors. Although they were pitched to different audiences, Home, a largely feminine audience, and Decoration and Glass, an implicitly masculine, professional audience, these magazines both projected values strongly aligned to national identity, such as youth, energy and ambition, and linked these values to the development of the city. The dream presented in these magazines was one where the economy flourished, where work was plentiful, and where citizens could lead lives of hard work, leisure, beauty, sophistication, and a strong sense of civic duty. Through these magazines, all manner of issues associated with civic life became part of the social space of the home, from architecture and city planning to questions of national identity and international politics. Their visual representation of labour were part of this larger discourse. To borrow the term used by Marion Quartley to describe social class and the nation, these images of labour were, quote, desire-driven abstractions, end quote, intimately connected to national and civic identities. Quite a number of Australian and international scholars like Quartley, as well as Jo Harris, June Senyard, and Lenore Lehman, have shown how throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, labour was personified in newspapers and magazines by the Australian worker as hero, who often stood in opposition to the top-hatted fat man of capitalism. From the period preceding Federation in 1901, certain values and beliefs imbued representations of labour, including youth, unity, liberty, freedom, democracy, and nation building. These were, of course, highly contested values, which vary significantly according to different political agendas. Linking these civic values with images facilitated flexible interpretations. Quartley shows that in labour newspapers and periodicals, the worker was typically personified as, quote, lean and muscular, with a strong jaw, a handsome youthful face and fine features. The worker was lean by virtue of his physical labour. He was a nation builder and good nation building material, fit, healthy and white, end quote. And I would add, typically male. Decoration and Glass maintained this orthodoxy of race, gender and class in its images. Australian workers depicted in these magazines were almost exclusively white, and work was divided along gender lines. While men worked in industry as welders, farmers, drovers, military men, architects or lifesavers, women worked in the home or as secretaries, beauticians, cleaners, shop assistants or waitresses. There was also an important class dimension to this imagery of work in these magazines. Tradespeople and factory workers were typically pictured with their heads down, backs to the viewer, or from a very long distance. Their individual identities were obscured, so they could act as symbols of their industry, their organisation, or its workmanship. Whereas working class workers featured as anonymous symbols or types, individual identity was critical to the representation of middle class workers. Home regularly featured portraits of professional white men in its Men of the Month section. As in the regular Who's Who section of Decoration and Glass, photographs in Men of the Month always focused on suited white men's faces, showing them either facing the camera directly or in three-quarter profile. The portraits were accompanied by descriptions of these men's education, family connections, and their contributions to civic life. The lack of identity in depictions of industrial labour could suggest the dehumanising qualities of this work. There was certainly some discussion of this issue in Home in the late 1920s. Curlewis's celebration of Sydney as a city in transition also described some concern about Sydney in the machine age. She described a perceived change in the spirit of the people, where individual effort and craftsmanship, quote, seemed to be swamped by the soulless routine of standardisation and mass production. However, Curlewis went on to predict how the industrial worker was to become a symbol of the collective effort. She wrote, "The pleasure of individual effort is gone, but it is possible that the future will find a pleasure in community working akin to the pleasure of community singing. The effort and courage of a single man no longer obtain a monument, but the gigantic harbour bridge is in its way a monument to the effort and courage of man in the mass." Appreciation for the effort and courage of man in the mass and the harbour bridge as a symbol of his achievement gained strength during the Depression, which hit in 1929, the year after Curlewis's publication. The bridge not only kept hundreds of workers employed during the Depression, it spawned extensive development in North Sydney after its completion in 1932. Representations of construction workers took on new meaning during the Depression as the growing Sydney Harbour Bridge became a symbol of hope, opportunity, egalitarianism, and fighting spirit. Home featured many images of workers dwarfed by the vast enterprise of bridge building. In photographs by Harold Casneau, the British photographer E.O. Hopper, and others, emphasis was on the strength and courage of the workers who stood authoritatively amidst the steel, rivets, concrete and cables forming this enormous monument of modernity. Other images of heroic industrial workers were scattered amongst the fashion, interior design and architectural spreads in Home during the early 1930s. The December 1931 issue includes a Hopper photograph captioned "Man and Machine," featuring a white man thoughtfully examining the rim of an enormous wheel, as though the machine is reliant on his focus and precision. Industrial photography provided an important source of work to photographers like Casneau during and after the Depression, when private commissions became less frequent and their studios became quieter. The task of picturing work thereby also helped to create work for photographers. By the time that Decoration and Glass was launched in 1935, the worst of the Depression was over, and this kind of imagery of heroic white male workers had become cemented. A tentative sense of optimism about Sydney's building industry accompanied the launch of Decoration and Glass. Referring to the industry as a barometer of national economic feeling, the magazine frequently spoke positively about its growth. In 1936, it reported on a 100% annual increase in the total value of buildings erected in Sydney and its environs between 1934 and 1935 to total £7 million. While conceding that this was a long way from the 1929 high of £16.5 million, the editor concluded, "We can only read the message of concrete, bricks and mortar and know that the clouds must be lifting over the horizon." The mid-1930s also became a period of increased work for Ichiro Kageyama, whose photographs of many of these new buildings began to appear in Home in 1935 and Decoration and Glass in 1936. Kageyama's initial contributions to home were framed according to his Japanese heritage. A spread of photographs of shrines, a theatre, temples and bustling streets in Tokyo, taken during Kageyama's trip to Japan in 1934, was published in the May 1935 issue, and his subsequent contribution was headlined "Sydney Seen Through Japanese Eyes." Images of soaring structures and new high-rise buildings appear in this spread, and look forward to several other urban spreads in the same vein, published in the following years. One image shows the beautiful Art Deco British Medical Association building, completed in 1930. A window washer is dangling precariously halfway down the facade. By photographing the building looking upwards and at a sharp angle, Kageyama heightens the sense of dynamism created by the vertical lines of the facade, so the high-rise building seems to be shooting skyward and dragging the window washer along with it. Kageyama used a comparable technique in this photograph, which was published twice in Decoration and Glass in 1936. The angle creates a sense of drama and risk, while the cargo hangs from the crane above the street. In his many subsequent contributions to home between 1936 and 1940 were images of icons of white Australian national identity, from gum trees and pastoral landscapes to Sydney's beaches, farmers and bronzed lifesavers in an Australia Day parade. Although the magazine continued to publish regularly on traditional Japanese design, culture and international travel, almost all of Kageyama's photographs after his initial contributions celebrated a distinctly white Australia. The racial biases implied by these and other photographs of the city and workers published in Home and Decoration and Glass contrasted with Kageyama's own experience of work as a commercial photographer. There was a thriving Japanese community in Sydney during this era of white Australia. Japanese firms such as Kuwahata, Kanematsu and Nakamura all had offices in Sydney. Senior merchants of Japanese trading firms were well connected with the Japanese consul and Sydney society, and many of their families made homes in the leafy suburb of Cremorne or the adjoining North Shore suburb of Mossburn. Restrictions on Japanese immigration under the Immigration Restriction Act had eased somewhat in 1904, when laws were changed to allow Japanese merchants, tourists and students to enter the country for 1 year on passports without being subject to the dictation test. Later exemptions could be made through the Certificate of Exemption from the Dictation Test, which allowed Japanese people to stay in Australia for up to 3 years before reapplying for exemption. The founding publisher of Home, Sidua Smith, socialised with Sydney's Japanese merchants and diplomats, was interested in modernism's links to Japanese aesthetics, and was a supporter of the Australia-Japan Society, which formed in 1928. As a guest at Japanese consul events, including official celebrations of the Emperor's birthday in 1930, 31 and 32, Hugh Smith mixed with the Consul General and senior merchants of Sydney. He may have met Kageyama at one of these events. By the mid-1930s, Kageyama's commercial studio was ticking along nicely, with clients including the Sydney Morning Herald, the Atlantic Union Oil Company, and Japanese consular officials who hired him to photograph social events at the Japanese consulate. In 1934, the photographer reported his income as averaging at £6 per week, which was slightly higher than the national wage average. At a time when the White Australia policy denied him access to Australian citizenship and its associated rights, Kageyama's image-making helped to position him as an active contributor to civil society, a worker and an entrepreneur. Kageyama's work as a photographer and his many images tell a very different story of labour to the images of work published in Home and Decoration and Glass. His is not a story of heroic workers building a white Australia, but a more complex and racially diverse narrative of highly productive social, personal and professional interaction, as these photographs, taken as part of a private commission for Shigeyoshi Hiroto in 1934, suggest. Hiroto was at the time of these photographs a very successful merchant. He arrived in Sydney 30 years earlier at the age of 34 to begin a wool classing course at Sydney Technical College. The photographs document Hiroto's return to Belltrees, a 220,000-acre property run by Henry Luke White and his 3 brothers. Hirota was based at Beltrees during his Wool Class placement, and there established long-term friendships with White and his family. Years later, Hirota told his family that he owed his career to Henry Luke White and Mr. Kitamura, who was the manager of Kanematsu, who helped facilitate the placement. Interestingly, when a selection of images from this commission was published in Home, none of them included the Japanese men. The image of white Australian labour prevailed. The reasons for this difference between the image of race, work and the city published in these magazines and the work of image making are not as simple as framing the magazines as markers of the dominance of the white Australia policy. This image was certainly part of the story, but not the only story. Rather than attempt to outline all of these stories, this brief look at the intersection of images of labour, the city and race in Home and Decoration and Glass is intended to be a provocation about method that raises questions about which aspects of magazines we examine and why. It can be very tempting to read modernist magazines through their often tantalising visual content as an affirmation of mainstream national identities or as something a bit more avant-garde. However, a much richer story can be developed by looking more deeply at the people who contributed to magazines and the character of their work with and beyond these publications. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the ongoing discussion about modernity and national identity in popular magazines throughout this event.